The blade rose with the morning sun over Bamberg. On May 1st, 1573, a 19-year-old man named Franz Schmidt stepped into the city square, not as a spectator, but as the executioner. Before him knelt a condemned thief, bound and trembling, his eyes darting between the crowd and the edge of the sword. For Schmidt, this was not simply a moment of punishment, it was the moment his life's path was sealed. With a single stroke, he began a career that would end 394 lives. Schmidt was not born into this grim profession by choice. His fate had been carved long before his first kill. His father, Heinrich Schmidt, had been a woodsman, an ordinary man, until the Margrave of Brandenburg-Ansbach commanded him to take on the role of executioner. It was not a request, but a decree. In that instant, Heinrich's life and the lives of his descendants were altered forever. In the eyes of the empire, he was no longer a simple man of the forest, but a wielder of death. From that day forward, the Schmidt family carried a mark of dishonor. In the Holy Roman Empire, executioners were both essential and untouchable. Their work was sanctioned by law, but their presence was seen as spiritually polluting. They were tolerated by rulers and city councils, but despised by neighbors. The stigma reached even their children, who were often barred from guilds, denied communion at church, and shunned in public life. To be born into such a family was to inherit exile. Yet Franz Schmidt did not seek escape. Instead, he resolved to confront his fate and transform it. Trained under his father in the town of Hof, he mastered not only the mechanical aspects of death, strangulation, sword beheading, public humiliation punishments, but also the discipline and solemnity required to perform them. Execution was not chaos, it was a ritual bound by law and custom. And so, in Bamberg, a rising administrative center of Franconia, Franz performed his first public execution. That day, he wrote in his meticulous diary, "On May 1st, 1573, I wielded the sword for the first time in Bamberg." The words were brief, almost clinical, but their weight was immense. A youth, burdened with dishonor, had now inherited the empire's justice. To the city council, this was not a moment of spectacle, but of record-keeping. In ledgers, his name was entered like any other civil servant. The executioner Franz Schmidt is paid for the sentence carried out. Behind that bureaucratic line was a young man who had just killed, not in cruelty, but in the name of order. Over the next decades, Schmidt rose in prominence. Unlike many executioners who often drank heavily or fell into corruption, he pursued discipline and precision. He was determined to prove that his role could be carried out with honor. City councils across Franconia came to rely on him, not simply because he could kill, but because he did so without error, without sadism, and with an unwavering commitment to law. In time, he became one of the most sought-after professionals in the empire. Yet to understand Schmidt's work, one must understand the rituals of justice in his world. Executions were not merely punishments, they were theatre, ceremony, and moral lesson, enacted before the eyes of the community. The sword was Schmidt's signature. A beheading by sword was considered the most honorable form of death, reserved for criminals of higher social rank or men deemed worthy of dignity even in punishment. A clean strike symbolized justice delivered with precision. A botched stroke, by contrast, brought shame upon both executioner and city. Schmidt, by all accounts, never failed. His diary records, on the 15th of July, 1589, I beheaded Andreas Rascher with the sword. He had murdered a man on the road to Würzburg. To the victim's family and to the community, the swift blow was not only retribution but reassurance. Other punishments were far more brutal. On the 3rd of April 1587, Schmidt executed a serial killer with the breaking wheel, one of the most dreaded devices in Europe. The condemned's limbs were shattered one by one with an iron club, sometimes while he remained conscious, his body then braided into the wheel and left for birds and passers-by. To modernize, it is a scene of horror. To Schmidt's contemporaries, it was a symbol justice stretched out, limb by limb, to reflect the crime's enormity. Women, too, faced gendered punishments. Schmidt recorded cases of Sack-Stor's death by drowning in a sewn sack. This was the prescribed fate for mothers convicted of infanticide. Sometimes, in keeping with older Germanic custom, a dog or rooster would be placed inside the sack as well, a grim symbol of disorder returning to the waters. Though not always public, such executions were solemnly witnessed by officials, meant to wash away a sin too disturbing to ignore. And then there was fire. Burning at the stake was reserved for crimes seen as corrupting to the soul and dangerous to society's moral fabric, heresy, sorcery, or poisoning. Fire consumed not only the body but the memory, intended as a purgation witnessed in silence by the gathered crowd. In each of these rituals, Franz Schmidt played his role with unwavering calm. His duty was not cruelty but order. He did not revel in suffering, nor did he flinch from it. In his hands, punishment became both spectacle and reassurance, a performance of law that reminded the community of its boundaries. To the outside eye, executions might appear chaotic and barbaric, but in the world of the Holy Roman Empire, they were acts of statecraft. The shattered limbs on the wheel, the clean fall of the sword, the smoke rising from a pyre all spoke a language of authority. They declared that crime would not be tolerated, that the community was protected, and that justice had been served in full view of God and man. And at the center of this grim theater stood Franz Schmidt, once a boy born into dishonor, now the empire's most reliable hand of justice. From 1573 to 1617, Franz Schmidt stood upon countless scaffolds, his sword rising and falling under the gaze of thousands. By the time he retired, he had executed 394 people across the Holy Roman Empire. But to measure his life only in numbers would be to miss the paradox of his story. Behind the tally of deaths lay discipline, ritual, and a search for something few executioners dared to hope for: legitimacy. For nearly half a century, his work was the empire's justice given form. Each death he recorded in his diary was brief, written with the tone of a clerk, yet behind the words were lives ended and communities reassured. When he finally laid down his sword in 1617, it was not out of fatigue alone, but a conscious choice. At the age of 63, he had carried the burden long enough. The dishonor that had haunted his family for 2 generations would end with him. Yet Schmidt did not vanish into silence. Instead, he astonished his contemporaries by stepping into a new role, one that could not have been further from his old profession. He became a healer. This transformation was not as improbable as it seemed. Over decades of executions, Schmidt had developed a deep knowledge of the human body. He had studied anatomy through necessity: bones shattered on the wheel, tendons severed by sword, flesh burned by fire. What for others was horror had become, for him, a grim education. Now he turned that knowledge toward restoration instead of destruction. He began setting broken bones, tending wounds, and preparing herbal remedies. At first, people came to him reluctantly. The same hands that had ended lives now reached to save them. But in time, desperation overcame stigma. Word spread that Schmidt's treatments worked, that he had the touch of a careful, knowledgeable practitioner. Where once he had been watched with fear, he was now sought with hope. In his own diary, he recorded the shift with quiet understatement. "I ceased serving at the block and began attending to the ill." In this new calling, he found what he had long sought: dignity. The same precision that had made him a feared executioner now made him a respected healer. His remarkable transformation did not go unnoticed. In 1624, an extraordinary event occurred. Emperor Ferdinand II issued a formal decree, one that lifted the stain of hereditary dishonor from the Schmidt family name. For the first time in imperial memory, an executioner was declared Ehrlich honorable. The decree not only recognized Franz's decades of service, but also erased the centuries-old stigma attached to his profession. He was no longer socially untouchable. He was legally and morally restored, standing equal among the very people who had once shunned him. This recognition was more than a pardon. It was a reversal of fate. The man who had once lived at the margins of society was now brought into its heart. For the Schmidt family, it meant their descendants would no longer be marked by shame. For Franz himself, it was the redemption he had quietly pursued his entire life. When he died in 1634, at the age of 79, his grave in Street Roker Cemetery bore no symbol of disgrace. There was no emblem of the sword, no whispered curse of dishonor. Instead, it carried words of respect. A man once feared, now revered. His stone marked him not as a pariah, but as a citizen of Nuremberg, an extraordinary fate for one who had wielded the blade so long. Franz Schmidt's legacy remains one of history's strangest contradictions. He embodied both vengeance and mercy, death and healing. His life forces us to confront unsettling questions. Can justice, when carried out by the hand of an outcast, ever be truly accepted? Can a man whose duty was to kill ever leave behind honor instead of horror? Perhaps that is why his story still echoes. For in the strange balance of his life, executioner turned healer, outcast turned honored man, we glimpse the complex ways in which societies both punish and forgive, condemn and restore. His sword, once feared, became a symbol of order. His hands, once shunned, became instruments of healing. And in that paradox lies the enduring power of Franz Schmidt's story, proof that even a life bound to blood can end in honor,